In part 1 and 2, I talked about prostitution in Westeros only. This video, I want to move on to talk about prostitution in Essos and other places, as I promised in my other 2 videos. As I defined prostitution in part 1, though I know you guys didn't need it, I sorta have to do that again for this video because prostitution in Essos gets a little tricky. There's what we would define as prostitution and what those in the world of Ice and Fire, would label prostitution, and unfortunately in Essos, it gets a bit gunked up. So in Essos, a majority of the sex workers are actually sex slaves, but still called whores and prostitutes. In our world, a sex slave is most definitely not defined as a whore or prostitute. There is a very big difference between those that make the choice to sell their body and those that are forced into it with no choice. Calling sex slavery and prostitution the same in our world would be incredibly insulting to those victims and undermines the agency of men and women who make the choice to join the sex industry of their own free will. Unfortunately, in the world of Ice and Fire, these sex slaves are called prostitutes and whores, despite not having a choice. Because this is how the characters, and George, label these people in the books, I will be using whore, prostitute, and sex worker for these sex slaves, and including them in a video about prostitution, even though that would be incorrect in our own world. If this is something that bothers you, I completely understand, but I feel I'm giving enough warning and clarification for you to steer clear of this video if it isn't something you can accept or are okay with. So again, while I will be calling these sex slaves prostitutes and whores, it is only because that is how they are labeled in the books and viewed in their culture. I am not speaking for our own world or how I feel on the subject. So from parts 1 and 2, we know that the Seven Kingdoms, minus perhaps Dorne, have a very low view of prostitutes. Whores of the Seven Kingdoms are at the bottom of the societal ladder. It is often seen as disgraceful to visit them, and even if they escape that profession, they will forever have a stigma on them for once being a whore. Essos, on the other hand, has a much more relaxed view on prostitution, and it is generally more accepted there. In fact, some of their cities have a main export of sex workers, both slave and non-slave. There may be some reasons for this more accepting view of sex workers in Essos. One thought is the large slave population in Essos. This large slave population results in a lot of sexual abuse and exploitation, with a hefty amount of slaves forced to become prostitutes. Many who are then forced to receive tear tattoos beneath their right eye. In fact, slavery is such a huge thing in Essos. Depending on when and where you are, you may be preyed upon, stolen, and sold to the flesh markets of Slaver's Bay or the pillow and pleasure gardens of Lys. The corsairs of the Basculus Isles frequently preyed upon settlements, especially in Sutheros, to find these victims. The large number of slaves that become whores has created an enormous business in both male and female bed slaves in this area. This business is so thriving that certain areas in Essos are known and famous for their pillow houses and pleasure gardens, such as Lys, a city full of pleasure houses that can match any taste, no matter how exotic. In the city, they make an art out of love, training slaves and non-slaves in the arts of love and then selling them as bed slaves, concubines, and sometimes prostitutes. Another city, Yunkai, has a main export of bed slaves, including boy whores and much worse. Before they sell them, they are trained in the 7 sais and the 16 seats of pleasure, sexual arts greatly sought after. In Meereen, we know around 297 AC, the city had a plague and the brothels were paying double for healthy young girls and triple for boys under 10. Jorah tells Daenerys that if she sells enough of the enslaved children to Meereen, they could earn enough gold to buy them all the ships they needed to sail to Westeros. Then there's Volantis, known for having the highest slave population and more whores than most areas. Their slave population is so high, there are 5 slaves for every free man in the city. Volantis is huge on tattooing their slaves, and they always use a single tear tattoo beneath the right eye to designate their sex slaves. And fun fact about Volantis, sometime after fleeing Westeros, Princess Sarah Targaryen, daughter of the 4th Targaryen king to sit the Iron Throne, Jaehaerys I, became the owner of a famous pleasure house in Volantis. As stated earlier though, just because they aren't as looked down on in Essos doesn't mean they are better off. Many slaves are forced into becoming whores during their childhood, and they are prevented from ever leaving by the soul-crushing abuse and despair they endure on a daily basis. Typically, death is the only way out of being a sex slave, and even that is hard to go through with due to all the psychological torment. We clearly see what this torment can do when Tyrion visits the Sunset Girl, a slave whore in a Selhorus brothel. The woman doesn't say a word to Tyrion, and he notes that her eyes look dead, the scars on her back, and that she is a broken woman. Tyrion even thinks, "This girl is as good as dead. I have just fucked a corpse." This is only a tiny glimpse into what these sex slaves, forced to be whores, endure. And for being so much more prominent and accepted, the word whore is still used as an insult by some in Essos, such as by the slaver that calls Daenerys a Westerosi whore and a whore of Westeros. Daenerys actually gets called a whore a lot in this series. There are even some in Essos that might be embarrassed to be seen with whores. When with the Dothraki, Daenerys is aware that whores travel with their caravans and that some men are queerly shy about their coupling, which indicates that while prostitutes are less looked down upon in Essos, not everyone is comfortable with sleeping with them, at least openly. That could also be a cultural thing with the Dothraki though. You don't pay for women, you take them. Besides whore being an insult just like in Westeros, your past as a prostitute may haunt you in Essos just like in the Seven Kingdoms. If you escape slavery, you will still have some of your past held against you. The widow of the waterfront was once a pleasure slave that was taught the ways of the Seven Sighs and Yunkai. In her youth, Vegaro, a triarch of Volantis, bought the woman to pleasure him. Through their time together, the man fell in love with the woman, freed her, and then decided to marry her, which was a huge scandal. When her husband died, despite now being a freed woman and cutting the tear tattoos from her cheeks, there are still restrictions on where she can live and what she can do, such as no freed man may live within the Black Wall in eastern Volantis. And despite running many successful piers, shipping lanes, and docks in Volantis, she is still called Vegaro's whore behind her back. Demonstrating her past in sex slavery has not been forgotten. However, the stigma could be on the slave part, not prostitution part, as we see non-slave prostitutes treated very well in Essos, even when they move on to a new occupation. This stigma being more on slaves than prostitutes may be backed up by the counterparts to septas in Essos performing sexual services. Interestingly, there are religious prostitutes in Essos that bear no shame, such as the Geskari Red Graces, who live in the Temple of the Graces in Meereen. These women wait in their pleasure gardens every night, and if a man doesn't choose her, she must remain there until the sun comes up. The Red Graces garner respect even though they are prostitutes. There are, of course, other religious organizations that utilize slaves, though. The Red Temple is one example that buys slaves as children and makes some into temple prostitutes. So I think it would be safer to assume that your past being a slave is more damning than the prostitute part in Essos, especially given the demand for sex workers and the openness in which they are used in Essos. A sharp contrast to the Seven Kingdoms, where the use of whores and transactions with them are kept on the down low. It is also probably fair to assume that the area of Essos you're in determines the level of comfort and respect a prostitute gets, and that some cultures will be more or less okay with the practice or career field. Now I want to move on to some areas in Essos where there is prostitution but slavery is not allowed. In areas where slavery is forbidden, such as Braavos, the prostitutes are free men and women, though sometimes things get a bit sketchy even in the free cities, such as in Pentos, where Illario's serving women aren't technically slaves, but if told to have sex with someone by their employer, they won't refuse, and they are in perpetual debt, making them unable to say no. So they are basically slaves in everything except name to escape punishment from the free cities. Braavos is perhaps the best example of a city where no slavery is allowed and prostitutes are treated the best in all of Essos. The more relaxed take on whores in part is due to the city being founded by slaves, whores, and thieves, of course. There are three types or classes of prostitutes in Braavos. The lowest is the street-walking dockside whores. An example of this class is Canker Jane, a she who is really a he. However, given the large number of dockside whores, the more you have, the more likely you're going to get some crazy in the mixes. Braavos has its fair share of dockside prostitutes that may be hazardous to your health. The drunken daughter is a whore who is the sweetest woman you'll ever meet when sober, but then becomes super violent when she's drinking. She's been known to stab men while intoxicated. There's also Chevron, a dockside whore in Braavos who has killed and robbed a dozen men before putting them into the canals to feed eels. She even believes she's pregnant from one of the men she's killed. The next up are the whores kept in brothels. They are essentially tier 2. In Braavos, the best known brothel is the Happy Port, which sits across the Mummer's ship, a Mummer's playhouse, and is run by Mary, who claims to have the largest breasts in all of Braavos. This brothel is said to have the best whores, and some of the known whores in this brothel are the sailor's wife, who will only sleep with you if you marry her, with sometimes 3 or 4 weddings a night, Ina, who has one eye and can tell your future from a drop of blood, Blushing Bethany, a nice girl, Lana, the 14-year-old daughter of the sailor's wife, who has long, fine golden hair. Men pay 3 times as much for her at the Happy Port. And Isadora, who is from Ib and has a mustache. Finally, the highest and most desired are the professional courtesans who are world-renowned and enjoy high status in society. They are the first tier, first class among prostitutes. And while courtesans may not be called whores in Essos, they are highly likely to be trained in the arts of sexual services and are considered the top of the prostitution hierarchy, so they will be included in this video. The Courtesans of Braavos are famed across the world. Singers make up songs about them, jewelers shower them with gifts, merchant princes pay large amounts of sums to have them on their arms at feasts, balls, and shows. Men kill each other in their names, and craftsmen beg for the honor of their custom. Yeah, crazy different than how they're treated in most of the 7 kingdoms. Arya is told not to talk to them unless she is spoken to first by them. While their cost varies, a man in Braavos points out a captain would have to sell his ship to get one, and that their cunts are for lords and such. In Braavos, the courtesans have their own barge and servants to take them to their sexual encounters, and the Satin Palace is one place young girls go to who dream of being courtesans. Some of the most famous courtesans in Braavos are the Merlin Queen, who has her mermaids with her at all times, 4 young maidens who hold her veil and do her hair. The mermaids are always around their first flowering. The Poetess, who always has a book in her hand. The Moonshadow, who wore only white and silver. The Veiled Lady, who only showed her face to her lovers. Daughter of the Dusk, who is only described as beautiful. Nightingale. So beautiful, men are challenged to duels if they do not say she is the most beautiful woman in the world. One of the lies Arya tells is that she is the daughter of a man killed for saying her mother was more beautiful than the nightingale. A famous courtesan outside of Braavos is Johanna Swan, who became known as the Black Swan in Lys. Johanna, at the age of 15, was enslaved by Lyseni captains and taken to Lys when her cheap uncle, Lord Swan, refused to pay the ransom. In Lys, she became a celebrated courtesan known as the Black Swan, and essentially ruled the city in all but name. Finally, I mentioned in part 1 and 2 that I would talk about other non-Westeros and non-Essos areas of the world of Ice and Fire in relation to prostitution. The one other place I want to talk about in relation to prostitutes is the Summer Isles. The Summer Isles are located south of Westeros and Essos and west of Sutheros. The Summer Islanders are truly unique in that lovemaking and prostitution are cherished and encouraged. This is because they place special reverence to the god and goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. Sex and lovemaking is sacred to these deities, and the union of male and female is an act of worship to them. There is no shame found in it. Having sex essentially is their way of honoring their gods, and they also use sex to mourn their dead. What is fascinating about this and these people is that all Summer Islanders are expected to live in the temples of love that exist throughout the islands and share their body with anyone that desires them. Many of their highborn youths and maidens will serve in pillow houses for years after their flowerings to honor the gods. While most do not stay in the temple for more than a year, the most compassionate, skilled, and beautiful will remain. These priests and priestesses have incredibly respected status on the islands, and the art of giving pleasure is considered on par with creating music, dancing, or sculpture. And actually, a Summer Islander who went to the Seven Kingdoms to set up a brothel said, "The gods made our bodies as well as our souls. Is it not so? They gave us voices, so we might worship them with song. They gave us hands, so we might build them temples. And they gave us desire, so we might mate and worship them in that way." Even in the Seven Kingdoms, she upholds her people's beliefs on sex, and Tyrion notes that she considers herself some type of priestess. Prostitution is a hotbed of discussion and debate, just like in our own world. In the world of Ice and Fire, where you are located, how you are raised, and your own culture will heavily influence your view on prostitutes. Some areas, such as the Summer Isles, embrace it. Other areas, such as most of the Seven Kingdoms, look down on it but consider it a sort of necessary evil. Other areas, such as many places in Essos, thrive on the occupation, with some enslaving others to profit off of it. George manages to capture the complex relationship individuals and cultures have with prostitution and sex in general. So thank you, George, for creating a world with so much depth that videos like this are possible to make. So thank you for listening to my series on prostitutes in the world of Ice and Fire. I will be posting this later as a complete video, putting parts 1 through 3 together, so don't be confused if you see that posted at a later date during the Game of Thrones season. I loved researching for this video, I had a lot of fun, and I hope to do more series like this in the future. If you have any questions on any parts of the prostitution series, please put them in the comment section below. I'll be doing a Q&A video from the questions I've had as I've posted this series. Alright, please like this video, subscribe, and come back for more videos.